They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, arrogance is the ultimate poison. I spent 30 years as the invisible failure in a house that worshipped only wealth. I learned that sweet revenge never comes from screaming or tears. True vengeance is a cold verdict delivered beneath the seal of the United States, where the people who trampled me must finally bow in silent terror to the absolute power I actually hold. Hello and welcome back to Daisy Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment. My name is Harper Mason, and I am 32 years old. If you looked at me sitting at the far end of the long mahogany dining table, you would think I was nothing more than a ghost haunting my own family. The dining room of my parents' estate was a monument to their suffocating wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the heavy silver cutlery and the imported porcelain plates. The air was thick, practically unbreathable, choked with the pungent, heavy smoke of my father's expensive Cuban cigars and the overwhelming stench of his boundless ego. I sat there in silence, a masterclass in patience, enduring another excruciating family dinner that felt more like a tribunal where my very existence was the crime. At the head of the table sat Arthur Mason, my father. He was a ruthless real estate tycoon who ruled his corporate empire and his household with the exact same iron fist. Tonight, his chest was puffed out, his face flushed with the kind of arrogant heat that only comes from absolute power and expensive scotch. He was holding court, loudly bragging about an upcoming civil lawsuit. It was a massive case, with millions of dollars on the line. But to Arthur, it was not a serious legal battle. It was a theatrical stage. It was a grand opportunity for him to crush his rivals publicly and flex the financial muscle of his empire. "They think they can challenge me," Arthur bellowed, waving his lit cigar through the air like a maestro conducting a symphony of destruction. "They think a few fancy lawyers and a couple of $1 million can put a dent in Mason real estate. I am going to bury them so deep in legal fees they will be begging to declare bankruptcy by next Tuesday." Sitting to his immediate right, exactly where a favored child should be, was Sterling. Sterling was the young, slick, and insufferably arrogant vice president of my father's company. He leaned forward, his perfectly styled hair gleaming under the chandelier, and let out a sycophantic laugh that made my stomach turn. "You have them cornered, sir," Sterling said, raising his glass in a toast. "The strategy is flawless. They will not even know what hit them until the judge slams the gavel. It is brilliant, truly brilliant." Arthur beamed, his eyes crinkling with deep affection as he looked at the young executive. He did not look at me that way. He never had. To Arthur, Sterling was the golden boy. He was the brilliant, ruthless heir that my father had always craved but never received. My father made no secret of his disappointment that his only flesh and blood was a daughter who showed zero interest in hostile takeovers and corporate sabotage. Across from Sterling sat my mother, Clara. She was a woman whose entire existence was defined by her social standing, her country club memberships, and the designer labels draped across her sharp shoulders. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her vintage wine, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped delicately around the crystal stem. Then, as if she had suddenly remembered I was in the room, her cold, judgmental eyes locked onto mine. "So, Harper," Clara began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension that she had perfected over decades. "Are you still wasting your life with that measly computer repair job I was speaking with Beatrice at the club today? Her daughter just married a prominent neurosurgeon. Meanwhile, my daughter is crawling under desks to fix broken wires for minimum wage. It is embarrassing. Harper, truly embarrassing. You need to quit that ridiculous little hobby. Fix your hair, and start attending my charity galas. It is high time you found a wealthy husband before you completely age out of the market." I did not flinch. I did not sigh. I did not offer a single word of defense. I kept my face frozen in a mask of terrifying, utter calmness. I carefully picked up my fork, sliced a small piece of the roasted duck on my plate, and placed it in my mouth, chewing slowly. Over the years, I had learned that reacting to their emotional abuse only fed their egos. My silence was the only armor I needed against the toxic sexism and the relentless cold warfare of this aristocratic household. But deep down, beneath the quiet exterior of the invisible daughter, a furious, triumphant fire was burning. As I swallowed the food, an overwhelming wave of absolute contempt washed over me. Clara thought I was a glorified technician. Arthur thought I was a worthless disappointment. And Sterling, the golden boy, thought he was invincible. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that my measly computer repair job was actually my role as a high-ranking federal operative. And more importantly, none of them knew that Sterling, the man my father worshipped, was the mastermind behind a massive international money laundering ring. As they laughed and drank their expensive wine, they had no idea that my intelligence agency had spent the last 2 years tracking every single dirty dollar he moved. The trap was already set. The final net was closing in, and I was the one holding the strings. The cool night air was a sharp, welcome shock after the suffocating heat of that dining room. I slammed the door of my sedan, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, leaving the sprawling gates of the estate far behind me. The winding roads of the wealthy suburbs blurred into the sleek, neon-lit arteries of the city. I was done playing the silent, invisible disappointment. My destination was hidden deep beneath an unassuming concrete building in the industrial district. This was the subterranean stronghold of the Office of Digital Infrastructure Security, known as ODIS. It was a highly classified branch of the federal government, operating entirely off the grid. To the outside world, this agency did not exist. To the shadow brokers, financial terrorists, and corrupt corporate executives of the world, Otis was the invisible hand that could crush their empires in a matter of seconds. I pulled into the heavily fortified underground garage and stepped out. A retinal scan, a voice print analysis, and 2 heavily armed guards cleared my path. The heavy steel vault doors hissed open, revealing a massive, soundproof command center bathed in the cool, blue glow of dozens of holographic monitors. The frantic hum of servers and the rapid clicking of keyboards filled the air. The moment my boots hit the floor of the command center, the atmosphere shifted. I was no longer the pathetic computer repair technician my mother mocked. I was the executive director of Cyber Crisis. Here, I commanded a legion of the nation's most brilliant tactical minds and forensic accountants. I held the absolute authority to freeze global assets, dismantle international trade routes, and bankrupt multinational conglomerates with a single keystroke. In this underground fortress, I was a god. It was nearly midnight when I strode into the central glass-walled briefing room. 5 of my elite agents were already waiting, standing at attention around a massive digital table. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I slammed my clearance badge onto the console, bringing the central screens to life. "Listen up," I ordered, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a blade. "We are executing Operation Gilded Cage tonight. Pull up the latest financial ledgers for Mason Real Estate, specifically the offshore shell accounts flagged under the Vice President's credentials." Agent Miller, my lead forensic analyst, tapped his screen. A complex web of red lines and glowing nodes appeared, connecting my father's legitimate business to a dozen black market syndicates. "Director," Miller said, pointing to a massive cluster of data, "we have finally cracked the encryption on the Cayman Islands servers. The Vice President has been actively funneling over $85 million in illicit funds through the company's upcoming commercial development projects. He is laundering cartel money right under the nose of the CEO. The paper trail is flawless, and it all leads directly back to his personal signature." I stared at the screen, analyzing the exact numbers. Sterling thought he was a genius. He thought he could use my father's blind arrogance to hide his massive financial crimes. He was wrong. The evidence was absolute, undeniable, and devastating. "Print the extraction orders," I commanded, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "Initiate a Level 1 asset freeze on all domestic and international accounts tied to this network." Agent Davis looked up, his brow furrowed. "Director Mason, do we need to coordinate with the local police department for the seizure?" "No," I replied sharply. "Local law enforcement is completely bypassed on this. This is federal jurisdiction under the Emergency Security Act. I want every single dollar locked down before the sun comes up." I picked up the heavy titanium pen from the console and pulled the physical authorization document toward me. With one swift, decisive motion, I signed my name. With that single stroke of ink, Sterling's entire illegal fortune was completely vaporized. He just did not know it yet. Just as I handed the document back to Davis, my secure comms device vibrated. It was a direct, encrypted message from the Director of National Intelligence. I read the brief text on the screen, my eyes narrowing. "Change of plans for the extraction," I announced, looking around the room. "Headquarters wants a public demonstration. The primary target is attending a major civil trial tomorrow morning at the federal courthouse. Orders are to execute the arrest warrant locally. During the proceedings, they want me on the floor to oversee the apprehension." The agents nodded, immediately springing into action to coordinate the tactical strike team. I stood alone at the head of the digital table, looking at the glowing red target over Sterling's face. A cold, razor-sharp smile slowly spread across my lips. Tomorrow was the day my father intended to flaunt his power to the world. He wanted a stage. Now, he was going to get one. I realized, in that quiet, electric moment, that this was the perfect arena. I was not going to fix my family through emotional pleas or tearful confrontations. I was going to rewrite the entire hierarchy of my bloodline using the terrifying, undeniable suppression of absolute legal force. The golden boy was going to fall. The empire was going to burn, and I would be the one holding the match. I left the underground command center at 4 a.m. I did not send a text message to my mother. I did not leave a voicemail for my father. The most lethal weapon in any tactical operation is the element of absolute surprise, and I was going to wield it with surgical precision. I decided right then that I would not breathe a single word about my true identity, nor would I offer them even a fraction of a warning about the catastrophic storm hurtling toward their perfectly manicured lives. Let them sleep in their luxurious beds. Let them dream of their golden boy and their millions of dollars. Before I left my secure office, I sat down at my encrypted terminal for one final piece of preparation. I bypassed the standard judicial firewalls with a few quick keystrokes and accessed the highly secure internal docket system for the federal court in Seattle. I located the file for the morning proceedings presided over by Judge Vance. He was an old-school, strictly by-the-book adjudicator who did not tolerate interruptions or grandstanding in his courtroom. With cold calculation, I uploaded my unredacted intelligence identification dossier directly onto his private terminal. I bypassed the clerks, the secretaries, and the bailiffs entirely. When Judge Vance booted up his system at 8 o'clock in the morning, my classified file, my top-level security clearance, and my supreme title as executive director would be sitting right at the very top of his digital desk, glowing in bold red text. When the sun finally rose, I stood in the center of my stark, minimalist apartment and prepared for the execution. The meek, invisible daughter who wore oversized sweaters and kept her head down was dead. I opened my closet and pulled out my official uniform. It was a custom-tailored, pitch-black suit designed specifically for high-ranking federal operatives. The fabric was crisp, sharp, and cut with ruthless precision. I slipped into the jacket, feeling the weight of the tactical fabric settle over my shoulders. I pinned my gold federal badge to the inside of my lapel, its surface cold and heavy against my chest. Looking in the mirror, the woman staring back at me radiated an imposing, almost terrifying authority. The transformation was absolute. I arrived at the Seattle Federal Courthouse precisely 45 minutes before the gavel was scheduled to drop. The massive stone pillars and heavy bronze doors of the building usually intimidated regular citizens, But today, they felt like the gates to my own personal arena. I walked straight up to the heavily fortified entrance. The armed federal marshals manning the metal detectors took one look at my face, registered the encrypted clearance pinging on their devices, and immediately stepped aside. I did not have to empty my pockets. I did not have to show a plastic identification card. They simply unhooked the velvet rope and nodded with deep, silent respect as I glided through the checkpoint. I walked into the cavernous courtroom and completely ignored the crowded wooden benches reserved for the general public. Instead, I moved toward the elevated, isolated gallery on the right side of the room. This section was strictly partitioned off, bound by heavy brass railings, and reserved entirely for visiting government officials and federal monitors. I sat down in the oversized leather chair, crossed my legs, and waited in the heavy, suffocating silence. Exactly 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, right on cue. Arthur, Clara, and Sterling made their grand entrance. They did not just walk into the room, they paraded into it. They carried themselves with the sickening, haughty arrogance of royalty inspecting their peasant subjects. My father strutted forward in a bespoke navy suit, his chest puffed out, already glaring at the opposing legal team with predatory hunger. Sterling walked closely behind him, flashing a brilliant, arrogant smile to the gallery, completely oblivious to the federal crosshairs painted directly on his back. My mother trailed behind them, her eyes sweeping the room to gauge who was watching their glorious arrival. That was when her gaze snagged on me. She stopped dead in her tracks. I watched from my elevated seat as she tapped my father on the arm and pointed discreetly in my direction. Even from 50 feet away, I could read the profound disgust twisting their features. They rolled their eyes in perfect unison. "Look at her," Clara whispered, her voice loud enough for the sharp echo to carry across the quiet aisle. "She actually showed up. She has the nerve to sit up there and try to leech off our family's success." Arthur sneered, shaking his head with bitter contempt before turning his back on me to take his prominent seat at the plaintiff's table. I did not react. I simply leaned back in my chair, staring coldly down at the backs of their heads. The air in the room was growing thick and heavy, exactly like the breathless quiet right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. They thought I was a pathetic parasite trying to steal a sliver of their glory. They had absolutely no idea that I was the apex predator, and the cage doors had already locked shut behind them. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his deep voice echoing off the high, oak-paneled ceilings of the massive courtroom. The heavy, rhythmic scrape of wooden chairs filled the cavernous space as every single person in the gallery stood up in unison. The courtroom itself was a vast, intimidating chamber specifically designed to make ordinary citizens feel incredibly small. Towering columns of dark, polished mahogany lined the walls, and thick velvet curtains blocked out the morning sun, relying entirely on the harsh, unforgiving artificial lights hanging from the high ceiling. Judge Vance strode up to the elevated bench, his black judicial robes billowing around his rigid frame like a storm cloud. He was a man well known throughout the legal community for his absolute lack of patience. He was a notoriously strict adjudicator who ruled his domain with an iron fist and held zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. He took his heavy leather seat, slowly adjusted his thick reading glasses, and curtly ordered the plaintiff to begin their opening statements. Arthur's lead attorney, an overly polished man wearing a shiny gray silk suit, immediately marched up to the wooden podium. He adjusted the microphone with a sharp tap and launched into a painstakingly tedious, long-winded presentation regarding the specific clauses of commercial contract terms. His voice was a flat, monotonous drone that seemed deliberately designed to put the entire gallery to sleep. "Your Honor, if we closely examine Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the initial binding agreement signed on the 14th of October, it explicitly states that the defending party holds full liability for any operational deficits." The lawyer droned on, aggressively shuffling a massive stack of thick manila folders. "Furthermore, this blatant breach of fiduciary duty resulted in a direct loss of over $6 million in projected quarterly revenue for my client." From my isolated, elevated vantage point in the government gallery, I watched the pathetic performance unfold like a poorly directed stage play. Down in the front row, positioned exactly in the center of the plaintiff's table, Arthur and Sterling were putting on their own sickening display of absolute confidence. They were practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. Arthur sat with his legs spread wide apart, his elbows resting heavily on the mahogany surface. He was leaning forward with the predatory hunger of a wolf waiting to feast on a trapped animal. Every single time his expensive lawyer emphasized a severe penalty clause, Arthur would nod his head aggressively, a tight, vicious smirk playing on his lips. Sitting directly beside him, Sterling was somehow even worse. The so-called golden boy of the company was overflowing with toxic arrogance. He casually crossed his right leg over his left, constantly shaking his foot in a rhythmic, self-satisfied tempo that irritated my eyes. He spent far more time admiring the reflection of the courtroom lights bouncing off his $50,000 platinum watch than he did looking up at the judge. Occasionally, he would lean over, whisper a snide comment behind his hand to my father, and the two of them would share a synchronized, mocking chuckle. They genuinely believed this was just another easy, guaranteed victory. They thought they were about to crush their corporate opponents into absolute dust, completely unaware of the invisible federal crosshairs painted squarely on their backs. The lawyer droned on for another solid 15 minutes, reading aloud from endless pages of dense, mind-numbing financial jargon. The air in the room grew stale, warm, and unbearably heavy. The only sounds competing with his voice were the rapid, mechanical scratching of the court reporter's machine and the low, constant hum of the centralized air conditioning unit. Therefore, under the strict stipulations of the commercial code, the lawyer continued, raising a single dramatic finger into the air, my client demands immediate financial restitution for the total sum. He never got to finish his statement. High up on the elevated bench, Judge Vance suddenly raised his right hand. It was not a gentle request for a brief pause. It was a sharp, flat palm held rigidly in the air, a universal and absolute command to cease all movement. The attorney's mouth clamped shut instantly. The next word completely died in his throat. The sudden, violent absence of the lawyer's booming voice created a terrifying vacuum in the massive room. The silence was immediate, heavy, and profound. It was not just quiet. It was a suffocating stillness that physically pressed against the eardrums of everyone present. The ambient noise of the building seemed to vanish into thin air. In that sudden, echoing void, the only sound left in the entire courtroom was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the large antique clock hanging on the far back wall. Tick, tick, tick. Down at the front table, Arthur's smug smile instantly froze on his face. Sterling's rapidly shaking foot stopped dead in its tracks. The golden boy slowly lowered his arm, his perfectly groomed brow furrowing in genuine, deep confusion. The two men exchanged a quick, highly uncertain glance. This was definitely not part of their script. Judge Vance was supposed to sit there quietly and let their expensive attorney perform his magic. Up on the bench, the judge was entirely focused on the private, encrypted monitor positioned directly behind his wooden gavel. The soft, artificial blue light from the digital screen reflected clearly against the thick lenses of his reading glasses. I knew exactly what he was looking at. The red, highly classified notification had just successfully breached his secure internal terminal. He was currently reading my unredacted intelligence dossier, slowly absorbing the terrifying reality of the Office of Digital Infrastructure Security. I watched his weathered face closely, carefully studying the microscopic shifts in his facial expressions. For the first 20 minutes of the trial, Judge Vance had looked utterly bored, his eyes half closed with weary, everyday irritation. Now, as his eyes rapidly tracked the classified text scrolling across his digital screen, his entire physical demeanor transformed. The warm color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw tightened until the muscles popped. The casual, slumped posture of a bored adjudicator vanished entirely, replaced by a rigid, breathtaking stillness. His features hardened into an expression of absolute, unadulterated shock. which then quickly melted into profound, terrified reverence. The absolute silence stretched on for another agonizing 10 seconds. The tension in the room was so incredibly thick, it felt like actual physical pressure crushing down on the chests of the audience. The opposing legal team looked around nervously, shifting in their leather seats. The court reporter hovered her trembling fingers anxiously over her keys. Arthur gripped the hard edge of his table, his knuckles turning pale white as the suffocating quiet dragged on. Finally, Judge Vance slowly exhaled a long, shaky breath. He reached out with a trembling right hand and pressed a single button on his keyboard, permanently closing the encrypted file. He then slowly lifted his heavy head, completely ignoring the confused, wealthy men sitting at the plaintiff's table. He did not look at the highly paid lawyers. He did not look at the armed bailiff. Instead, his gaze swept over the entire crowded room, bypassing all the tailored suits and the panicked, confused faces, until his eyes locked dead onto the isolated government gallery. He stared directly at me. I sat there perfectly still, my legs crossed gracefully in my sharp black tactical suit. I held his intense gaze with eyes as cold and unforgiving as shattered winter ice. I did not blink. I did not offer a polite smile. I simply let him look upon the absolute, unquestionable authority that had just seized complete control of his courtroom. The heavy, suffocating silence in the courtroom was shattered by the sound of Judge Vance pushing his massive leather chair backward. The agonizing scrape of wood against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, to the absolute astonishment of every single lawyer, clerk, and spectator in the room. The notoriously strict, unyielding judge did not just sit up straight. He stood up completely. He rose to his full height, his dark robes falling around him, and he physically turned his body away from the bench to face the isolated government gallery where I was sitting. He cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly, completely stripped of its usual booming arrogance. "Let the official court record reflect," Judge Vance announced, his words ringing out with a frantic, desperate clarity. "The supreme presence of Executive Director Mason, commanding officer of the Office of Digital Infrastructure Security, the federal court formally acknowledges your ultimate jurisdiction over these proceedings. Director." A collective, jagged gasp ripped through the room. The expensive lawyers at the plaintiff's table froze, their pens dropping from their hands and clattering uselessly against the mahogany wood. Down in the front row, my father and Sterling looked as though they had been physically struck by lightning. Their smug, victorious smiles melted off their faces, instantly replaced by a grotesque cocktail of absolute confusion and rising panic. I uncrossed my legs and slowly stood up. I did not rush. I let every single second of my movement burn into their retinas. I smoothed the lapel of my custom black tactical suit, letting the gold federal badge catch the harsh courtroom lights. When I finally spoke, my voice did not belong to the silent, invisible daughter who endured decades of their emotional abuse. My voice was a weapon. It was echoing, sharp, and bone-chilling, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute federal authority, instantly dominating every square inch of the vast space. "Identity and clearance confirmed, Your Honor," I stated, the icy cadence of my words freezing the air in their lungs. "I am assuming direct tactical control of this venue under the Emergency Security Act." For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Then, the fragile dam of my father's megalomania violently burst. Arthur Mason, a man whose entire existence was built on absolute control and unwavering narcissism, simply could not process the reality unfolding before his eyes. His brain furiously rejected the terrifying truth. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, veins bulging aggressively against the sides of his thick neck. Arthur slammed both of his heavy fists down onto the defense table with a violently loud crash. He shoved his expensive chair backward and jumped to his feet, wildly pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Arthur roared, his voice cracking with hysterical rage. "Completely abandoning every single rule of courtroom decorum? What kind of sick, twisted joke is this? That is my daughter. She is a worthless, pathetic computer repair girl. She fixes broken wires for minimum wage. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Judge, I demand you throw her out of this room immediately before I have your badge for this profound incompetence. Judge Vance did not flinch. Instead, his face hardened into a mask of pure, unrestrained fury. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a deafening, explosive crack that made my mother physically jump out of her seat. He hit it again and again. The aggressive, rhythmic pounding violently drowned out my father's pathetic screaming. "One more word out of you, Mr. Mason, and I will have you thrown into a federal holding cell for the next 6 months for egregious contempt of court," Judge Vance bellowed, his voice echoing with absolute menace. "You will shut your mouth and you will sit down immediately. You clearly have absolutely no idea who is standing in this room with you. Director Mason possesses the supreme, unmitigated federal authority to seize your assets, dismantle your corporation, and liquidate your entire financial empire before you even finish your next breath. If she commands it, you do not exist. Do you understand me?" Arthur stood frozen, his mouth hanging open in a silent, grotesque display of horror. The fiery red anger drained from his face in an instant, leaving behind a sickly, terrifying shade of paper white. His knees visibly buckled, and he collapsed back into his chair as if the bones in his legs had suddenly turned to dust. I did not even look at him. My father was no longer the target. He was just collateral damage. I stepped forward, walking slowly down the carpeted steps of the gallery until I was standing directly in front of the small wooden gate that separated the audience from the trial floor. I locked my eyes onto Sterling. The so-called golden boy was practically sinking into his expensive chair, his previously confident posture completely destroyed. He was shaking. I could actually see the fabric of his tailored suit vibrating. "Sterling Vance," I called out, my voice slicing through the deadly silence like a scalpel. "Vice President of Mason Real Estate. As of midnight last night, the Office of Digital Infrastructure Security successfully decrypted the offshore shell accounts routed through your personal signature. We have fully documented the $85 million in illicit funds you laundered for international criminal syndicates using my father's commercial development projects." Sterling let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp. He grabbed the edge of the table, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped rat looking for a sewer drain. "By the supreme authority vested in me by the federal government," I continued, raising my voice so that every single syllable hit him like a physical blow, "I hereby execute an emergency arrest warrant for high treason, international wire fraud, and aggravated money laundering. Furthermore, I have officially authorized the absolute permanent freeze of all domestic and international assets tied to your name, your family, and your associates." "No," Sterling whimpered, his voice incredibly small and pathetic. "No, please, Arthur, tell them it is a mistake." He reached out and grabbed my father's sleeve, but Arthur ripped his arm away as if Sterling were covered in acid. Arthur was staring at me, his eyes wide, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization of what I had just done. Before Sterling could utter another pathetic word, the massive, thick wooden doors at the back of the courtroom were violently kicked open, the heavy bronze handles smashed against the marble walls with an explosive crash. A team of 20 heavily armed federal tactical agents swarmed into the room like a tidal wave of black Kevlar and heavy weaponry. They moved with terrifying speed, their heavy combat boots thundering against the wooden floorboards, completely ignoring the screaming lawyers and the panicked spectators. "Federal agents, do not move," the lead tactical commander roared, vaulting over the wooden railing and charging directly toward the plaintiff's table. Sterling screamed. It was not a defiant yell. It was a pathetic, high-pitched shriek of absolute terror. He tried to scramble backward away from the table, but he tripped over his own expensive leather shoes and crashed hard onto the floor. 2 massive federal agents grabbed him by the shoulders, violently hauling him back to his feet. They slammed him face first against the heavy mahogany table, violently twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp, mechanical clicking of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed perfectly throughout the silent room. "Please!" Sterling sobbed hysterically, his perfectly styled hair now a sweaty, tangled mess hanging over his crying eyes. Tears were streaming down his face, dripping onto the polished wood. "Please, I will give you whatever you want. I will cooperate. Harper, please, you know me. Do not do this to me. I beg of you." I stared down at him, my expression completely hollow, offering him absolutely nothing, not a sliver of pity, not a drop of mercy. To the left of the table, my mother let out a horrific, breathless gasp. Clara clutched both of her hands tightly over her chest, her diamond rings digging fiercely into her skin. Her face was entirely drained of color. She swayed violently in her high heels, her eyes rolling into the back of her head, and she heavily collapsed against the wooden railing, miraculously caught by one of the frantic lawyers before she hit the ground completely unconscious. But it was Arthur who truly captivated me, my father, the untouchable titan of industry, the man who spent 32 years making me feel like a worthless speck of dirt, was completely, utterly broken. He sat rigid in his chair, his hands trembling violently on his lap. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He slowly raised his head, his wide, bloodshot eyes meeting mine. The arrogant, powerful tycoon was dead. In his place sat a hollow, terrified old man staring into the cold eyes of the Grim Reaper. He finally understood the terrifying truth. His invisible, despised daughter had not just defeated him. With a single, calculated sentence, I had effortlessly crushed his entire golden legacy into absolute, unrecoverable ruin. Judge Vance struck his heavy wooden gavel one final time, the sharp crack officially suspending the trial indefinitely. The echoing sound had not even faded before I turned on my heel and began my march down the central aisle. The transformation of the massive room was truly remarkable. The same wealthy spectators and arrogant corporate lawyers who had sneered at me only an hour ago now scrambled wildly to get out of my way. They pressed their bodies flat against the heavy wooden pews, physically holding their breath as I passed them. The sea of expensive tailored suits parted automatically, yielding the floor to the only true authority left in the room. I could feel the intense heat of their stares on my back. It was a potent, intoxicating mixture of absolute terror and deep, unspoken admiration. I stepped through the massive bronze doors and out into the vast, naturally lit marble corridor of the federal courthouse. The heavy tactical boots of my uniform echoed sharply in the empty space. Then, I heard the frantic, uncoordinated scuffling of leather shoes directly behind me. "Harper," a desperate, breathless voice called out. "Harper, my daughter, please wait." It was Arthur. He had somehow found the strength to drag his trembling legs out of the courtroom. I did not break my stride. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the glowing exit signs. He stumbled after me, his voice a pathetic, stammering whisper echoing pitifully off the cold marble walls. "You have to listen to me," Arthur pleaded, his tone stripped entirely of its lifelong arrogance, replaced by the naked, pathetic whimper of a broken man. "We are blood. You cannot just leave me like this. You have to protect the family name." He was reaching out, desperately trying to cling to a microscopic sliver of hope, praying that my absolute federal power would somehow shield his crumbling empire from the apocalyptic financial fallout. I did not turn my head. I did not pause for even a fraction of a second. I simply walked right past him as if he were a complete stranger standing on an entirely different planet. He was no longer a towering tyrant. He was just a hollow echo of a highly toxic past. I pushed open the heavy glass doors leading to the bustling street, leaving him alone in the cold, cavernous hallway to drown completely in his own public, catastrophic humiliation. 6 months later, the dust finally settled, but the impact of that morning permanently reshaped the landscape of corporate America. The tactical takedown of the money laundering syndicate became a massive, unprecedented national security victory. The operation made headlines across the globe, completely destroying whatever remained of Mason real estate. Meanwhile, it elevated my name to the absolute peak of federal power. I was no longer a hidden operative. Director Harper Mason was recognized as a terrifying, untouchable force within the highest political circles in Washington. Late one evening, I was sitting alone in my secure corner office overlooking the quiet, dark waters of the Potomac River. The soft glow of my encrypted terminal illuminated the stack of classified files resting on my desk. A quiet digital chime broke the silence. A personal email had managed to bypass the lower security filters due to a registered familial link. The sender was Arthur. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and opened the message. Part of me expected a furious, unhinged rant. Another part expected a pathetic, tearful plea for financial salvation. But what I read was far more pathetic than either of those options. There was absolutely no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the decades of severe emotional abuse or his criminal negligence. Instead, it was a forwarded message thread addressed to his few remaining, terrified business contacts. In the text, Arthur was actually bragging. He was shamelessly boasting to his associates that the supreme, feared director of the Office of Digital Infrastructure Security was his own flesh and blood. Even in the absolute, burning ruins of his life, his blind, suffocating narcissism found a desperate way to try and leech off my success. I stared at the glowing screen, and for the first time in 32 years, a genuine, completely weightless smile spread across my face. I felt no anger. I felt no resentment. I felt nothing but pure, absolute freedom. I clicked the cursor and permanently deleted the email from the secure federal server, wiping his final, pathetic words from existence. I turned my attention back to the critical national security documents waiting on my desk. I finally understood the profound truth that had eluded me for my entire life. A person's true legacy and inherent value are never found in the validation of those who are too blind and arrogant to see it. True worth is not a gift handed down by toxic parents at a wealthy dining table. It is forged in the fire of silent resilience. It is built upon unquestionable capability, quiet courage, and the absolute, undeniable authority you carve out for yourself in this world. Thank you so much for listening to the conclusion of this story. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, our channel is currently operating with zero monetization from the platform. If you felt moved or entertained by today's journey, please consider supporting our hardworking team with just $1. Your kindness allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can feed their families and continue bringing these powerful, high-quality stories to life for you. You can easily help us by scanning the donation QR code right here on the screen, or by clicking the support link located in the video description or the pinned comment. Stay strong, remember your true worth, and I will see you in the next story.